they're not familiar with what the conversation, the discourse is like in the world of atheism or in the world of Islam. So, for example, in the world of Islam, it's very much a lot of machismo. It's a lot of smack talking, right? And I'm not saying it's good, but it's the reality of in the world of, say, debating Muslims and whatnot. If you don't come with confidence and some degree of machismo, it's sort of like the Arab mind is not going to listen to you or pay any attention to you. But if you show that you're not afraid, you're not scared, the insults don't bother you, don't care, they're a little more apt, I think, to listen to something like that.
Welcome to a conversation with Jay Dyer on manhood and masculinity. My name's Paul Robson, and I've had Jay Dyer on my radar for quite some time. One of my friends really follows his work and has been doing so for a long time, but I haven't really had the reason to dive into him until I saw a survey which showed that of people converting to the Orthodox faith, there's a lot of them that are coming from influencers online, especially on YouTube. And number one on the list of names of people that are having this impact is Jay Dyer. And we're not just talking about a small little trickle of people here. We're talking of tens of thousands of people that are coming into Orthodox Christianity, a really major life decision based on the impact and the work of this person. And so Jay Dyer is often seen as a controversial person. I've seen some people use the word toxic. And so I was really interested in who is this guy? Where is he coming from? And what is he all about? And so I decided to contact him and asked him if he's up for having a chat, and he was up for that. Well, I was very happy about that. And I've only just watched a couple of his conversations, which has been his apologetics work, the discussions. One of them was like a really polemical, aggressive debate. Another one that I saw was incredibly valuable. Stefan Molyneux, discussion with a guy who I've been following Stefan Molyneux for some time, long before I became a Christian. And so I really actually enjoyed listening to them talking about it at a very high level in a masculine, respectful, and clear way as well. So I thought let's have a chat with this guy, and yeah, I'll let you decide for yourself what you think of Jay from the conversation here. I really found him to be open, engaged, and also no filter as to not saying stuff that could be politically incorrect or something like that. I actually made a mistake right at the beginning of our interview. It took Jay, I can't say less than 1 minute. It took him 1 minute and 3 seconds into our conversation to actually correct me on a mistake that I made, which I really appreciated. I think it's great that he's a man who will, if he hears something that's wrong, and he actually stood up in the defense of Catholics, Roman Catholics, who would normally be debating with. So I thought that was great. So last thing before I give you the discussion with Jay, then I'll mention that Manifesto Core is the organization that I'm running. We have a network of online men's groups, which is really made for men who appreciate being men and masculinity. And we focus these groups on setting goals and supporting each other in reaching them. So if that's interesting, then check it out. Otherwise, here comes Jay Dyer. Jay Dyer, great to have you on board for a conversation about masculinity from an Orthodox perspective.
Thank you, man. Glad to be here. Sorry we couldn't do it back when we originally planned to. Things got really hectic. It's Christmas time, and I'm around. We're traveling and around family and all that, so I'm trying to juggle a whole bunch of stuff. And but I'm glad to be here.
Great. Yeah, it's a busy time. I actually just sent out a message to our network saying, like, as a man, you want to be engaging yourself in the Christian tradition, celebrating it, being a part of it. It's something that really unifies us as a society, as a family, and communities. So I think it's an important thing. And so I'm just happy that you have the opportunity to have the talk here. And I think it's a subject that's more relevant than it's ever been almost. It continues to gain relevancy. I just saw the Catholic Church. You've also been posting a little bit about this, right? The Catholic Church decided to bless homosexual marriages. And so there's a lot of things that have been very stable for a long time that are shifting at the moment.
Unions, not yet marriages. So they'll make a big fuss about that and say, no, not marriages, just unions.
Yeah. I'm not used to.
That's the step to the next phase.
Yeah. My apologies. Yeah, I'm not so good at that precise language. I'm not a philosopher myself.
No, I'm just saying they're gonna say, if you say that, you're not being honest, because it specifically says not marriages, but unions. The blessing of a union or a couple is the step before the blessing of the marriage. So it's just an incremental plan to bring that in.
Things are sliding and shifting and breaking apart, it
Right.
seems like. And what we want to do today in this conversation is, and what I want to do is to get your take on if we go really back into the oldest ideas in Christianity and the Orthodox tradition of what it means to be a man, then what do we take? So I thought where it would start actually is, are there particular church fathers in the Christian Orthodox tradition which you think have spoken to you and have been relevant regarding the understanding of man, woman, and the relationship between them?
Well, I think many of them have spoken to it in a relevant way, particularly through Genesis, right? So we need to either believe the Genesis account or not. And one thing that's interesting is that marriage itself really is grounded in the book of Genesis. And so if Genesis isn't relevant to us, if it's all, purely allegory or something like that, then there's not really any reason for societies to have this idea of marriage. So it's intimately tied to divine revelation. Doesn't really make sense unless you're, I don't know, trying to gain, if you're a woman trying to marry an A-list actor and get half of his, stash, I guess marriage can make sense in that way. But,
Mhm.
in the modern secular atheist sense, I don't really see why anyone would get married. It just seems like a formality that's not really relevant. And I think the younger you go, the more that, they've been indoctrinated, they see it that way. So, marriage only makes sense in terms of Genesis. And I think when it comes to Genesis, a lot of church fathers the majority have been pretty explicit that they have a historical view of Genesis, that it was a 6-day creation. Basil has the Hexameron, 9 sermons on the historicity of Genesis. There's really only a couple church fathers that even kind of somewhat diverge from the 6-day narrative. Maybe Greg of Nyssa. I don't count Origen because he was a heretic, but Augustine has the view that it's an instantaneous creation, not a 6-day creation, but that doesn't support theistic evolution. So most people who want to try to argue a theistic evolution or an evolutionary worldview in Orthodoxy are combating, again, almost all the church fathers, except for, and again, Augustine's it doesn't afford any evidence for the evolutionary view, because he just has this weird instantaneous view because of his problem with God acting in time and space. So because he has a absolute divine simplicity view, he struggles with this in the Confessions. He says, I don't see how God could create in time and space if he's an absolutely simple eternal being. So thus what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, in our view, is kind of tied to the Genesis narrative. And there's a hierarchy, a structure set up there in Genesis, and to diverge from that hierarchy is already also in Genesis. That divergence is the very sort of rebellion that Satan introduces through the idea that man can displace God, woman can displace man, right? There's this sort of upwards revolutionary movement in man's fall. Well, Satan wants to displace God. Man thinks he can be like Satan and be like God. And then woman thinks she can be like man and, rebel as well. So, and then the curse, is that your desires shall be to rule over your husband, but he shall rule over you. So the exposition that most of the church fathers have, if you read something like Genesis, Creation, Early Man by Father Seraphim Rose, pretty much just reflects what I conveyed. So I would say there's a good book called First Created Man by St. Simeon the New Theologian. And that's kind of a medieval Byzantine defense, you could say. It's not directly defending 6-day creation because that wasn't really doubted yet on a large scale, but it is relevant to that. And so I know that today's talk's not about 6-day creation, but all of this relates because, evolutionary theory is really what was crucial in getting rid of the belief in Genesis. And getting rid of Genesis doesn't just get rid of, the idea of special creation. Again, it's going to eventually affect the ideas of marriage, because if the Genesis narrative isn't the case, then there's no such thing as marriage. It's just a social contract. It's a thing that human society developed out of nowhere for practical or survival reasons or whatever. So it doesn't make any sense without that sacramental perspective. So, but I don't know of any specific church fathers that just kind of treat manhood per se, other than outside of kind of Christology and anthropology, in the councils, what we get with, who the person of Christ is. But I would say that divine revelation already kind of has some pretty clear standards of manhood with, Old Testament figures like David, Samson, Abraham. These are all masculine figures who went to battle, who's had their faith tested, who were tempted in various ways, be it with, women, be it with wealth, be it Solomon, right? I mean, we have all of that in Scripture as kind of other paragons of what masculinity should be.
Yeah. So I want to go back to what the thing you started with by saying it's like, it all depends on if you see the Genesis account as being true. So I converted to Orthodoxy some 5 years ago, and very much, I think a big influence on me over the last years has been Jonathan Peugeot, Lord of Spirits, these kind of online sources where it's very much about like patterns of being. And there can be a tendency to have a large focus on the Genesis account as kind of like, these very compressed stories that have been taken from like, maybe even millennia or, Jordan Peterson kind of understanding. And then it's been compressed down into these simple oral tradition stories. And that's something that's quite easy to buy into and to understand and get a lot of value from. And then I actually read Seraphim Rose and his arguments for that pretty much every single one of the church fathers saw this as a historical account. So yeah, okay, yeah. I think it was in, I can't remember, I think it was in another book that I read it where he came with the same arguments as well. Anyway, but would you would then also go say really, that?
Yeah, this one's really important because it's basically everything that he wrote on Genesis. So it's not just like exegesis of the church fathers. He also has like philosophical arguments against evolution. So I'm not discounting the other work that you're talking about, but that book is really good because it's specifically about like the totality of this subject. But go ahead.
Yeah. So you would say when it comes to saying is the Genesis account true, you mean in a historical sense? And I mean the 6-day creation, would you also say then like that the timeline of some 6,000-7,000 years ago is also necessary understanding of how our
so history of the Orthodox Church, right? So the history of the Orthodox Church has the Byzantine calendar, and the Byzantine calendar is based on the Genesis account. And so I forget the exact number. I'm not being like a hard ass about what the specific number is that you have to believe in. And I don't know that the church fathers ever say that, oh, you have to believe in this specific age per se. But the New Testament, for example, is rife with of cases where Jesus, Paul clearly state that Adam and Eve were historical beings, and they were historical in the sense of the same way that Jesus is historical. And so, for example, we have throughout the book of Genesis countless prophecies of the Messiah and what lineage he will come from. That lineage is recounted in the genealogies in the New Testament, the Gospels, right? And so it's very important that we have a genealogy that's consistent to show that Jesus fulfills this prophecy of being the descendant of Abraham, because if he's not the descendant of Abraham, then he doesn't fulfill those prophecies. And there's many, many of them throughout the book of Genesis, right? The other thing too is that the book of Genesis is really important for teaching the doctrine of the Trinity, because the doctrine of Trinity is not something developed in the New Testament period. It's not a development. It's a Trinitarian, it's a Hebrew doctrine that we have to stress. And that's contrary to a lot of modern religious notions of evolving tradition, evolving comparative religion theories, that the ancient world was pagan and then it evolves to monotheism and then it evolves to atheism, right? That's kind of a traditional secular narrative. So what I'm saying is that we can't go to a bunch of secular people who don't believe the New Testament or the Old Testament to tell us the true meaning of the book of Genesis. We got to go to the enlightened people within our tradition who experience and have seen the divine light, and that's our church fathers. That's our tradition. So while there might be insights in Carl Jung or Plato or Jordan Peterson, they're not going to be the ones that can tell us these key doctrinal issues about whether Jesus is the second Adam. To be the second Adam, according to St. Paul, has to mean that he's the same bodily structure and nature that Adam had. Otherwise, he doesn't redeem and resurrect these bodies. And that's crucial to the New Testament's, theology of the body, so to speak. So recapitulation is a doctrine that's very fundamental to Orthodoxy, which is that Christ recapitulates and restores all of human nature in the general resurrection. And also that he will restore the entire universe. So if you read Romans 8, Paul's very clear that the entire creation was subjected to death as a result of Adam's sin. Mm-hmm. So death cannot be a natural phenomenon. And pretty much every theistic evolutionist has to state in some way that death is a natural phenomenon. They'll say, well, physical death is natural, spiritual death is unnatural. The Genesis account makes it very clear that when Adam sinned, he introduced death in every sense into the entropy into the physical universe, our bodies, and spiritual death. Mm-hmm. And so in the same way, Christ taking on our actual human nature to restore it, restores us and heals us both spiritually and physically in the universe as well. This is just the common Orthodox patristic teaching on recapitulation. And this is very clear from at least St. Athanasius all the way up until John Damascus and even later Byzantine theologians. So these are some of the theological reasons why it doesn't work to say, well, maybe Genesis is just purely allegorical, or it's just sort of these archetypal meanings. But I have to be clear here that, as Seraphim Rose says, quoting St. Cyril of Alexandria, we don't only say that something is purely literal, right? By the time of St. Maximus, the fourfold sense of Scripture is pretty normative, right? So this is the historical literal, the anagogical, the allegorical, the tropological, right? So you have these four senses of Scripture, and sometimes it's just boiled down to two senses, the literal and the spiritual. Mm-hmm. And even in the case of Genesis 1, most of the church fathers give it a literal and a spiritual meaning. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people in church history have faltered on both sides of this equation and gone into extremes either way. For example, in the early church, there was the Antiochian school of interpretation, and they always stressed the grammatical literal, mm-hmm. to the point that they actually ended up kind of being Nestorian, mm-hmm. in their Christology. Likewise, the opposite extreme, the Alexandrians, particularly after Origen, were almost wholly committed to the allegorical meaning, and they would sacrifice the literal meaning. Mm-hmm. Well, St. Cyril, who is himself of the Alexandrian tradition, one of our great theologians, makes it very clear that the spiritual is built on the literal, right? And so they both go together. Mm-hmm. And so it's not an either or. Mm-hmm. And so it's not a question of fundamentalism versus spiritual allegorical exegesis. That's false. That's a question of textual criticism issues, right? We're talking about hermeneutics. So hermeneutics is the science of interpretation. That means literal meaning, spiritual meaning. Those are questions of how we interpret the text. Mm-hmm. Saying that the texts are not historical, or that they're full of myths and errors, or that's all liberal hierarchical textual issues. So people confuse these things because the term fundamentalism arose in the 20th century in regard to Protestant theologians who were denying the fundamentals of the faith, namely the Trinity, the resurrection, the virgin birth, and so forth. So Protestants came up with this idea of the five fundamentals, mm-hmm. and that was a way to guard against, in their communions, the liberalization of denying things like the virgin birth or the Trinity. Mm-hmm. So ironically, anybody who says, well, I'm not a fundamentalist, well, you're already denying, like, that means that you're not believing in the five fundamentals according to the historical meaning of that term. Yeah. But I do understand what they're expressing, and they're trying to express the idea that we don't agree with fundamentalist evangelical hermeneutics of the text, which only stick to the literal and don't give the spiritual meaning. So that, mm-hmm. hopefully that clarifies.
Absolutely. So I'd like to go to, you touched a little bit on it, but one of the key things that for me has also spoken incredibly much about understanding man. And that's what I found, like the Orthodox Church has a lot of focus on this sentence that God created man in the image and likeness of God. And I think that in my, growing up in a Protestant family, then there's a lot of this kind of like idea of the sinfulness of man and the fall and, even total depravity in some cases. Yeah. Whereas in that understanding, then you spoke a little about death. And it was really a massive insight to me to have it presented to me that death was a gift to human beings. Like it was able to redeem us from the sinful nature. And so actually man wasn't born to die, but this was something that the church fathers, can you, maybe you can formulate that a little bit.
Yeah, one of the big differences that Orthodoxy has against most Western expressions of Christianity is the idea that death is unnatural. And this is pretty, universal in Orthodox theology, as far as I can tell, because death is tied to the angel of death, the entity, the being that brought death, the devil. So when man covenanted, you could say, in Genesis with the devil, he made a deal with death. And later on, Scripture actually says that man made a covenant with death, right? Echoing this idea of breaking the covenant with God in Genesis and then making a covenant with death, aka the angel of death, Satan, Lucifer, the serpent. And so man is now sort of under his dominion of Satan. That doesn't mean that he completely lost the image of God. And that's sort of the Luther himself, and then Calvin kind of go in that direction, so to speak. I mean, Calvin still kind of thinks there's some maintaining of the notion of
qualities.
Yeah. Magio Dei, but it's really discarded and messed up to the point, like you said, of total depravity, where man can't do anything good or in any way incline himself towards God or towards the good. So the difference, though, is that Orthodox theology makes a distinction typically in the Eastern Fathers between the image and the likeness. We retain the image after the fall, but we've lost the likeness of God, which we talk about as theosis or deification, the life of the Holy Spirit. I think it's Saint Seraphim of Sarov who said that the whole purpose of the Orthodox life is to regain the Holy Spirit, to regain the likeness. Yeah. So that for us is the uncreated life that we're seeking beyond just a mortal created life. And that's what we think Jesus is talking about, John 17, when he says he came to give us the glory that he had with the Father before the foundation of the world. That glory can't be a creature, right? God's eternal glory isn't created. It's uncreated. So we have to be then a sharing in uncreated grace. And really only Orthodoxy, in my view, has consistently maintained that what we're partaking of is uncreated grace. The Roman Catholic Church has dogmatized the idea of created grace, particularly post-Trent. Protestants, I think it's not really that clear because they don't really go into a lot of the specifics of this. But I think if you were to look at something like Calvinism, for example, the idea that what you're imputed with in imputation is the merits of Christ. The merits of Christ were merited within time and space. That's what he did as a man to perfectly fulfill the covenant of works in Calvinist theology. And so it still amounts to a form of created grace because it's something that comes about through Christ meriting in time and space. Those are created actions or works according to Calvinism. Therefore, because it was what Adam was expected to do. Adam's a creature. Adam failed the covenant of works. Jesus fulfills it in Calvinist theology. So that's what's imputed to you. That doesn't really exist in Orthodox theology because Christ is a divine hypostasis, a divine person who, from the very moment of his incarnation, deified the human nature that he assumed. So we are deified by partaking of that human nature that he assumed and deified through his redemptive actions. So that's very
Would you agree? I just finished reading the Triads by St. Gregory Palamas. And so that's this conversation that he had in, I think, 14th, 15th century with this guy called Barlaam of Cambria, where I thought it was amazingly well laid out. And it was this idea of the uncreated light that it was being challenged, where Barlaam felt that it was like knowledge that was the source of enlightenment, and where it's more like this first-hand personal experience of the uncreated that we can have as human beings because we are in this image of God and remain in that.
Absolutely. Triads is good. He has the same kind of debate with Akindinos in the dialogue with the Barlaamite. So it's basically the same kind of discussion and debate. And I think that's just faithful to what you see in scriptures with the theophanies being in time and space. The Roman Catholic positions always try to struggle with this, trying to figure out if the theophanies are created things. Are they holograms? Are they angels? And the Orthodox position is like, no, that's the uncreated logos in time and space. The Roman Catholics are always like, well, but you can't have the uncreated in time and space because it's absolutely simple. It can't undergo change. It can't move. It's not spatial. Well, that would undercut the incarnation. I mean, don't you understand that if that's the case, then you can't have an incarnation because the incarnation is a second hypostasis in time and space, walking around doing things, being in one location in a special way. Think also of the kenosis text, right? And in Philippians, where it says he humbled himself to step into our nature, which means that he willed to not exercise all of his powers. So therefore, you have to have some notion of a distinction between essence and energy for even the kenotic theology to be true, according to Philippians. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. They're very perceptive, but also again, in our view, the devil is the angel of death. Thus, death is going to intimately bound up with him, and death is unnatural. It's not a natural phenomenon, and that's why Paul in Romans 8 describes the reversal of death, even in the natural order, as repairing what Adam did. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, animals dying, that's a result of Adam's fall. That will also be repaired in the eschaton, in the recapitulation.
Can we talk a little bit about marriage as well? Because you also in the beginning mentioned that like the relationship between men and women was actually set in that Genesis account. So can you tell us what is the structure, what is the pattern of marriage? What are the key elements that we should be looking at for understanding that relationship properly, if Genesis is true?
Yeah, and there's another element I think that Orthodoxy has that's different from Roman Catholicism, which is the idea that even in the garden, everything was Christological. Mm-hmm. So Adam is made in the image, not of some generic natural theology, generic oneness, unity essence. He's made in the image of the Trinity, made in the image of Christ. Mm-hmm. So to say that Adam is made in the image of Christ right away is very revolutionary theologically, because that means that Christ was in the garden. That means that, again, the Trinity was taught in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. So if Adam is made in the image of Christ, then Adam is immediately an image, a Christological image or type. And that means that Eve is already a ecclesiological type. And everybody in Orthodox already knows this with, patristic exegesis, with the liturgy, with the hymns. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Mary's the new Eve, because Eve was a prototype of not just Israel, but also the church. And so the relationship there is already ecclesiological. It's already Christological. So it will never ultimately be divorced from or understood without being connected to the anthropology of the garden. And so that's why Paul says, like in Ephesians and in Colossians, that the whole universe exists for the church. Mm-hmm. And that's a really odd passage, because people don't really think about. Paul says all of the things that exist, all the created order of the universe exists for the church. And if you understand this cosmic scope that the Eastern Fathers, that Maximus and people like that, St. Maximus, that they stress, that begins to make sense. So what I'm saying is that the fundamental nature of not just physical reality, but man and woman is also Christological and ecclesiological. So we can't properly interpret the world without divine revelation and without a sacramental view of reality. Mm-hmm. And that includes understanding man's relationship to another being like a woman in a Christological, ecclesiological way, as well as all of reality being understood in this kind of male-female dynamic, which was set up by God intentionally as a good thing. So those boundaries that are set up between man and woman, this is very important, because even some of the Eastern Fathers got this wrong. Some of the Eastern Fathers went so far into kind of speculating that, for example, Nyssa, we all know Nyssa believed in a form of apokatastasis, which is a kind of a universal salvation he speculated on. But he also thought that gender was a result of the fall. Mm-hmm. But very clearly in Genesis, and I think Father Severin Rose takes issue with this and has a page or two on it in his big book. Mm-hmm. No, actually, Adam and Eve are already male and female before the fall. Mm-hmm. So we don't have to do clever exegesis to try to explain how, because they had this assumption that it was still influenced by Neoplatonism, that unity is better than multiplicity. Mm-hmm. And so if Adam and Eve are created distinct and multiple in a real distinct way, then that would imply some kind of lesser status. Mm-hmm. And so they try to sort of creatively wrestle with this to say, well, maybe the distinctions of biological and gender, differentiation are somehow a result of the fall. Mm-hmm. But I think that's a dangerous direction to go in. I think that's incorrect. I think that other church fathers and what Father Severin Rose argues is correct, that no, God, there's nothing inherently bad, wrong, or in an ontologically diminished status between having distinctions, between having two different things. Mm-hmm. So it's just a metaphysical assumption that unity is better than multiplicity. So
are you familiar? Sorry. Are you familiar with, I think his name is Paul Evdokiavs? He has a book called The Sacrament of Love.
I haven't read that, but I've read a little bit of that.
Okay.
of his stuff.
I'm busy reading it now. I'm struggling with it actually. It's pretty dense, and also some challenging ideas. So he goes a lot into this, and he also talks about like the marriage relationship, the nuptial relationship as the small church, and how
Oh,
that
okay.
is imaged
Yeah.
on God as well.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Um,
one, yeah,
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you
the
off. I feel like
one of the
I'm
things
rambling a
that
whole lot, but go ahead.
he kind of talks a lot. I found him to be far more. For example, I actually love the word patriarchy, and I think like we kind of need. I'd love to re-own that word
Yeah.
and for us to
Yeah.
appreciate all the depth and the meaningfulness in what patriarchy is. But he has a bit more of a critical approach in that and I think rightly points out that as a society we prioritize masculine values far too highly and don't appreciate the feminine approach to things. He speaks about kind of like how the masculine penetrates the world and through violence and through like the power of logic and rationality kind of like establishes things, while he uses the image of Mary just in her being and an acceptance, like things are born, Christ is born within her, right? And so yeah.
Yeah, I would disagree with all that. I mean, I don't know enough about his theology really to come at it with a critical perspective, but from what I'm hearing, I would disagree with that because I don't think we're in the age where the problem is too much masculinity. I think we've gone to way to the other extreme, if anything, right? So the problem now is this push, which I think is intentional. It's a geopolitical push. It's a deep state, State Department foundation push to push feminism everywhere. There's a lot of money behind it that's been behind it for 100 years, and that includes into the theological realm. And so I always hear the same kind of argumentation that, oh, well, we've neglected, female mysticism. Well, we need to look no further than the Roman Catholic Church, which about 400 or 500 years ago very heavily adopted a female-centric mysticism to the extent to the sacrificing of a lot of the rational. And I don't have a problem saying that scholasticism was too rational and overly intellectual. I agree with that. That does not mean that the answer to that is to rush into some feminine idea of histrionics, or that's what you see the Roman Catholic mystic women doing, that kind of in the 13 14 1500s sort of revolutionize and combat, you could say, spiritually speaking, the devotional aridity that was lacking in the Latin church. I mean, even Francis of Assisi is a form of a reaction against this stuff.
Yeah. But
And
I mean, I wouldn't equate.
I don't think the answer is more femininity. I mean, femininity has its place, but it is not. It is not something that it's the same kind of argument that what's that weirdo guy's the sophiologist guy, right? Like he makes the same argument that Mary is the hypostasis of the Holy Spirit. That's all ridiculous. It's all just a way to steer the church into ecumenism and downplay masculinity. So no, I totally disagree with that.
Okay. I mean, I would say modern feminism is more just like a hate of femininity more than it's a pushing of femininity. And I can definitely see in trying to promote these things in a kind of like political sphere or, openly, explicitly, I think one automatically will go wrong. I think for myself, I can see how I'm a very cognitive person. And so I try and really with my mind grasp ideas. And there can be a lack of a kind of patience in, maybe just spending time in my icon corner, not just reciting prayer after prayer after prayer, but trying to just be and listen a little bit more, being more receptive, something like that. And yeah, just the fact that, we see how the fetishization of the masculine or power, influence, money is seen as the only goods. I have had several conversations with feminists, and yeah, it's like so hard to them to understand. Like they talk about basically what they're just saying is they want like heroes with tits, or like women that could beat up 10 guys and be in the boardrooms. But the role of the mother, for example, is absolutely my wife, she doesn't work, she stays at home, and we living in Denmark, and she's had to face quite some criticism and like a lot of skepticism as well for wanting to do that.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I think you're right to say that as individuals, we might each individually need some kind of medicinal remedy like that if we're too extreme in one direction. But I don't think as a society as a whole, or that we have this, dangerous, toxic masculinity problem that's going on. I think we've gone in the other directions. What I'm saying. I mean, they're already pushing for, deaconesses, women priests in all the different denominations. Yeah. And that's, to me, one easy signifier that we've gone in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Let me try this is my pet theory about what's happened. I've never really, I haven't read it anywhere else, but this, in my kind of spiritual journey, coming from atheism, going through, coming back to Christianity, and then eventually finding the Orthodox Church, what the way I see it is that, like, the core problem that I've been facing and that I noticed in myself is this disconnection between the head and the body somehow. It's like I live sometimes up in a world of fantasies, but then my actions don't correspond to that. And there's this disconnect somehow, and it's very uncomfortable to bring them together. And I kind of see it as like the first place where this really became very clear was that we had a conciliar church that had like, we're a body and Christ was the head of the church. And then there was one of the patriarchs, the Pope of Rome, who said, no, I'm going to be the head. And so he lifted himself up above. And so there came this excessive focus on the head, which is kind of like an excessive focus in some ways of the masculine. If I'm below the head, then I'm in the feminine receptive role toward, at least in some sense, right? And so we kind of get focused on that. And then, of course, what happens when we concentrate too much power and attention on the head is that it can, it gets inflated, and then it can get corrupted, and then there's a rebellion that happens, and then things split off, and then the disconnect gets larger and larger. And so for me, that's the fundamental problem that we're facing in the West. And well, I have a really good Ukrainian friend who, they haven't been through, the Enlightenment period and scholasticism and all this kind of stuff. And I just noticed there's like a groundedness and a closeness to like daily practicalities. He's not too concerned about like all the things that we get all anxious and hyped up about. Sometimes, there's a lot of anxiety I notice when I speak to, just people here in Denmark, which doesn't seem to be so much in these other cultures a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think what I see on the ground in the U.S. is a lot of there's the difference in what men were like 20 years ago, like when I was graduating high school, as to what I see the men coming out of high school now. It's like the guys are noticeably in their bodily build and frame way skinnier, smaller, diminutive, noodle arms. I'm serious. It's not funny. Like, she's in there laughing. I'm like, that's what guys look like. And there are some exceptions to that. There's some guys that play football and whatnot, but I mean, I just think there's been a complete loss of masculinity. I was talking to a high school teacher yesterday, for example. We went to dinner with a guy who still teaches high school. He's taught high school in a kind of a rough area for 17 years. And he was explaining that it's not the same. Like, the guys don't go ask out girls. It's not like that anymore. In high school, they don't really go and have parties and do the things that typical teenagers would do. All they do is doom scroll TikTok. So I think we're overlooking the internet's role here. And I don't disagree with your assessment of looking back to, sort of the papacy stepping up to, the head or whatever. I think that was tied to theological errors at the same time. Those are all connected, like the Gregorian Revolution, the papacy kind of coming.
Ties together well with the Filioque understanding as well, I think, that kind of messes up this understanding between head and body or something.
Rather than accepting what is the mystery of the Trinity, which has already been laid down, we're now saying, no, we're going to squish the Trinity into a logical, syllogistic, Thomas Aquinas's Summa. And if that doesn't work, then, we'll set the theologians to, make it right. And they can come up with all the neologisms to make the system work. But that's an abstracting. So what I'm saying is that I see the same abstracting going on with, now that we all live out our lives on the internet. It's not really anybody's fault, because it's just the way society progressed. The decisions of different oligarchs and tech elites and the Pentagon. So now we all have our lives lived out in a more abstracted way. And what I mean by more abstracted is that most of the stuff that we're talking about now, like, we would have had to go meet each other in person 20 years ago. We would have had to, set up a camera and do an interview with microphones and blah, 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 fly to Denmark. I'd have to go meet these people to do these shows. Yeah. Now everything is distanced from that physical movement and interaction, and it's all kind of abstracted into this the cloud and the web and the internet. So it's a movement towards abstraction, which in itself doesn't have to be bad. But I think you're right that what it does is that it trains us to think that everything is truly abstracted and up here, and the body is worthless, pointless, doesn't matter. I actually think this is a big part of why people think that they can become another gender, is that they have lived in an abstract fantasy internet world, fantasy games, video games, living out your life on social media. And you can put your avatar as whatever you want, right? I can say that I'm furry 69 and I'm a blue furry creature, right? And I've been that on Twitch for 10 years, right? Then I start to believe I am that. That's the real me. And it's not this gross Gnostic bodily existence that I'm in. I can identify as that because that's where I spend most of my time and my focus and energy. Anyway, I'm rambling, but I'm just saying I agree with your point about the papacy, and I'm saying I'm like the papacy, like the internet is like the new intellectual papacy is what I'm trying to say, where we live out our abstracted existence away from our body. And the more I've seen things change from, I graduated high school before the internet was everywhere. So I knew what it was like before the internet. And now what I see is that people are more and more divorced from just basic humanity. I mean, that's, in other words, to understand what it is to be human, to have basic humanity, I don't think you can even understand it apart from what we have in Orthodoxy. So you're going to just basically go into madness, right? Like what's St. Anthony say in that quote? Like, eventually people will say, why are you not mad like we are? You know what I mean? Like that's where we're going, because we're fundamentally denying things like the body. And that might sound odd because you think, well, but they're telling you to follow your passions. They did for a long time, but now I think they're telling us to follow a new type of passion, which is like a weird, believe that you are whatever you mentally think you are. So that's actually a denial of the body. Like all the trans stuff, and even what you said about feminism, you're right. Feminism is actually an attack on women. And all the trans stuff, that's actually an attack on humanity and the body.
Yeah, and feminism is actually morphing into that. We have a really large and powerful feminist organization here in Denmark, and they are increasingly, pushing the whole trans movement as well. So that's absolutely, really interesting. So one thing that I was thinking when I was preparing this interview was I just have a very kind of superficial lay understanding of philosophy and dipped in my toes a little bit. I've studied political science. And I couldn't think of anybody who said anything worthwhile on this issue of male and female in the world of philosophy. In like Taoism, you have the yin yang symbol and this kind of stuff, right? And this is also caught into, because in my work, I work with men. And so we try and we have something we call the 10 principles, and we believe there should be masculine principles. But what I notice is that we fall into this kind of dualism a lot of the time, and reality just doesn't seem to fit into dualism properly as well. So I don't know, can you help me out there? Is how can I think about male and female in a kind of in the sense of like, Western philosophy and which I'm obviously trained in and brought up inside?
That's a really good question. I mean, I can only think of like, Schopenhauer is known for pretty severe critiques of women. I wouldn't go to as far as Schopenhauer does, but I think his critiques are correct. And I think he was probably reacting to burgeoning feminism in his day. So, even though we might think he's extreme, there's probably some good insights in Schopenhauer that people might be too timid. I'm not talking about you, I'm just talking about people in general, too timid to look at. But if you go back to St. Jerome, Jerome has some really severe critiques of women. He's kind of being tongue-in-cheek and comical. Like if you go to feminist websites or whatever, like the first person they'll go to is Jerome, right? They'll be like, oh, the evils of misogyny of St. Jerome. And he's just, I think, kind of a funny person. I've read enough of St. Jerome to think that not everything he's saying is completely literal. Like when he says that, I think he has some quote that's like, I'm not even sure if women have souls. I don't think he literally thinks that. I think he's just kind of like joking. He says something like that. I don't remember the exact quote, but we don't believe that theologically, obviously. But he's saying that, look, women are not made for the same things as men. men are made, as you said earlier, to do the go forth, conquer, right? I mean, men are focused towards the world and women's focus should be towards the man, right? And what we're told now in the last, 30, 40, 50, 60 years post 60s countercultural revolution is that men need to be more like women. By the way, I've read a bunch of those 60s countercultural dudes. They all say this. Like, for example, Terence McKenna says that it's high time for men to understand and adopt feminine attributes, namely shutting up, don't mansplain, be receptive, be emotional, listen to women's needs and emotions, all that. And it's all said from his vantage point, obviously, to bring in the technocratic order, because he's an open servant of that. He says the future of religion will be some kind of goddess worship, right? And so likewise, other people beyond just idiot psychonauts like Terence McKenna, I mean, you actually have high level geopolitical people also saying that we need to push feminism to change society. Anyway, and one of those things is to say that the man then focuses his gaze on the woman, his attention on the woman, and then the woman takes on the role of conquering the world, going into the workplace, getting a law degree, spending 30 years in a corporation. So it's been reversed on purpose. That's that form of inversion. And thank you. See, my wife brings me a coffee. That's the right order of things, right? And she's smiling at it. She enjoyed it. She's over there laughing and smiling. So, see, it makes women happy.
She admires you because she's a part of what you're doing, and she enjoys being able to contribute to what you're doing.
And we do this as a team, right? So, like, I'm the leader, and she's a team member. To use the various corporate analogies, let's use team building analogies like the corporate people do in their corporate strategies. Anyway, I'm rambling, but I think.
But Jay, what you said on the philosophy thing, that I'm not sure I completely got that, because it sounded quite disrespectful of women and their role and their importance and what they have to contribute.
Well, I thought you were asking, like, what are some philosophers that have spoken to this issue, and I can't even.
And you mentioned just a lot of people who are very disrespectful or critical of women.
I'm just trying to think of the ones that address femininity specifically, and I can only think of, like, off the top of my head, Schopenhauer and Jerome.
Okay.
So I don't know. What I'm saying is I don't know that we can look to philosophers for much help on. I know Jerome's not particularly a philosopher, for much help on this issue.
Yeah.
But I don't think ultimately this is that deep or difficult of an issue. It's like pretty basic in that. I mean, I think Jerome's right. Not that women don't have souls, but that, I mean, it's not the role of women to teach. It's not the role of women to lead in society. You can still be a Proverbs 31 woman and have a job and make money and do these kinds of things. Be active. You can be physical. Women can learn to shoot, can learn to hunt, all that stuff. Nothing wrong with any of that. So it's not the activities that are necessarily the problem. It's the idea that you have to reverse the roles, or that there's some sort of necessity that a man has to be more feminine in his attributes and qualities. I just don't believe that. I don't think that.
No, I mean, I fully agree with you that there is a very, very widespread idea that to be okay, men need to become more like women.
Right.
And this is a terrible thing for men to listen to. There's a lot of men who buy into it. They also believe that they have to tell everybody all of their feelings all the time, and especially the things that they're scared about or feel vulnerable about, or where they're weak or have anxiety. And it's like, I think it's good to have like a best friend. And I have a guy that I call every single day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And if I have something that's bothering me, I'll tell it to him. But I don't go sharing this stuff on Facebook, right? It's like this idea that you need to be vulnerable all the time and be oversharing. Like it's very, very unattractive. So we have all these young men today who are doing this constantly, and have a very it's very sad to see. And I often have guys who've been doing this. They come into me after they've been doing it for 5, 10, 20, 30 years, trying to be the nice guy in the relationships, and they've seen how all the hard ass alpha male types are getting all the women, and they've just like they get friend zoned all the time. And so they're like eventually like, what's happening here? I need to do something about this. And then it's hard for them to find the right balance again, because often there's some anger there as well and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's really difficult.
When you say philosophers dealing with this issue, like, my mind goes to the famous secular philosophers.
Yeah.
And I think in the secular world, you're always only going to kind of get these extremes, right? Of you know, somebody like Schopenhauer, who basically doesn't see much worth in women at all, or you know, some kind of radical feminist. Like that's your only two options you're going to get. So
so what is it that about this difference between male and female that puts it in the realm more of theology than why can't we understand in other words, it in a logical, philosophical way?
Right. You're going to have to look to the realm of theology is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I mean, even was it Aristotle who also said like a woman's basically a misformed man, right? That was his conclusion.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think we're overlooking things that are pretty well known, like Proverbs. I mean, Proverbs was kind of like a young Jewish man's catechesis. So, you know, what was catechesis like in, you know, the days of David and Solomon? Well, you'd read Solomon's Proverbs. So, I mean, what does Proverbs say? I mean, I think it has a balanced view. Of course, every feminist will say, oh, it's misogynist, it's evil. I mean, Proverbs is very balanced and accurate in the dangers of what you're going to encounter in the world of women, but also the positivity, the good things that you're going to encounter, a la Proverbs 31, when you find a good wife, if God bless you with a good wife, right? So, and I'm not saying we don't listen to Jesus, we listen to Proverbs. I'm just saying that, you know, Jesus's advice is that it's better if you can be single and you have that gift. If you can't, well, guess what? You're not. I see a lot of guys doing this, especially young guys in the religious world or guys that are new to Orthodoxy or whatever. Like they think that, well, I'm going to be married, but I'm going to act like and pretend like I'm a monastic. And I'll even take on a monastic name in my Twitter account and tell everybody what to do in marriage, even though I'm 19 or 20 and I've never been married. I've never had a date. And I think that's just really inappropriate, and it's just a mess. And I see that all over Twitter. But what those guys should be doing is, if you're not going to be celibate and in the monastic life, you're going to have to deal with the ways of this world. So you're going to have to learn to start a business, to be a man, to control your emotions. You're going to have to learn how to deal with women, how to go on a date. All those things are going to have to be learned. And a lot of guys are just lazy and they'd rather check out. So that's where you have the epidemic of incel. And really, again, Orthodoxy, as Father Deacon Ananias was pointing out, like you got two options, right? You've got the call to monastic life, or you've got marriage. There's not the third option of incel. So you have to like get to work. That's the point.
Yeah, it's so great to have that so clear. And for me, as a married man, it's a very, very powerful thing to realize that it's my marriage that is the vehicle for me to work on my salvation. You know, it's like if I feel like I'm struggling spiritually, if I feel my life is difficult, what do? I focus more on my relationship with my wife, and I try to grow in intimacy with her. And what I find is like, that's incredibly difficult because we see the world differently, and there's all kinds of things that we don't understand in each other. And when I try and then direct my attention towards that and really do it well, it's like I realize like this is probably the most difficult thing that I could ever do. And there's an infinite depth there as well. Like we'll never truly know each other except in God, right? And so
that's well put.
This Ukrainian friend of mine, his father was not a very strong churchgoer at all, but his mother was. And then the father fell sick with cancer, and everybody, and there was also money and everything like that to put the father in a home or in the hospital and kind of let him leave out there. But actually, the mother then insisted in being the only person to care for him.
I hope you're enjoying the conversation. A little reminder, if you want to be around other masculine guys that are setting goals, creating a personal vision, and working to integrate it into your life, then check out Manifesto Core. You can find the link in the description to this video. Thanks.
And she did this for 3 or 4 years, 3.5 years, I think it was. She was with him every single day and basically just was there, bringing her attention and helping him to come to know God. Because she realized, like, if this guy dies, he's half of me. I'm together with him for eternity. And so, and what happened is that they were, in these last final years of his life, well, there was incredible suffering and pain and, him losing his bodily functions. And they were being drawn together in the faith. That's the really hard work. But when you understand and you believe in the eternity of the soul, in the Genesis account, in that, man and woman are created to be in this relationship, mirroring Christ and the church, then it's a very powerful mechanism, right?
Yeah, the suffering has meaning, right? And like, I think if you're in the secular realm or whatever, the suffering is really a thing to run away from, and like, okay, well, you know what, this is not fun, I'm out of here, right? And it's just like a business contract that you're done with, right? The business deal is no good, so right, I'm out of here. But I mean, that's the point that I think where for us, the suffering has meaning. It has that redemptive training aspect to it. And I think for guys, guys deep down want challenges. They want the desire. They want to complete tasks, right? They want to have a goal and to complete that goal.
Yeah,
because that's how guys are made. That's their way of going out and sort of tilling the garden, so to speak, right? I think that the woman respects that when a man can do that. I just think we have to be really careful about not caving into, and I'm not saying you're doing this, I'm just saying your question earlier about women and should we be more receptive to this kind of stuff. I'm nervous about the the idea that the solution would be to, if men would adopt more feminine things, that I disagree with. Because I just think that on an individual level, it might be the case that maybe I'm too bullheaded and I need to listen to, some area where I'm messing up. But on the whole, I don't think that that's the problem in the church or in society is that.
Could you go along with saying something like, the place to do that would be in your prayer corner, in front of your icons, while as on your wife, and that should then lead to, in your relationship with your wife or your girlfriend or your in relation with women, that you're actually far more masculine, far stronger. Like that's how you're doing it right. Is that you can actually meet women in a far more clear.
I'm just thinking of like, so if
way.
I get on Twitter and I see, for example, people from Fordham or from the Phoebe Center or whatever that are pushing feminism in the Orthodox Church, and their whole argument is we have never been listened to. Women are displaced. The church is too masculine. I mean, Francis just said like 2 weeks ago, Christianity is too masculine. It's got to be more feminine, right? So I'm just talking about this kind of stuff on the public, global scale.
Yeah.
But Absolutely. On the individual remedial scale, I might go to my priest in confession and say, hey, I was way too, angry with Jamie this week. I didn't listen to her. I argued with her too much. He might say, well, you need to do this, medicine like you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So that brings me to, I think, what I wanted to talk about with you specifically was, how should I put this across? The reason why I reached out to you actually was there was a discussion on a Telegram group for the podcast that I run called Iron Sharpens Iron, where you're often put forward as an example as a person who's controversial in some way. And I the way I see it is you value truth, and you think that truth is arrived at through strong masculine discussion, or deeper truth is arrived at in that way. And bad ideas should be pointed out explicitly. And I think that maybe part of the confusion might come because people see the way that you discuss on YouTube, and then they think that they should go and talk to, their parents the same way or something like that, or something like that. So maybe where I could start with is saying, do you differentiate between how you approach a discussion on with it, like an atheist on YouTube, and how you do it in your personal life with people that you're in a relationship with?
Yeah, I think one thing to remember would be like roles in society, right? Like if I'm talking to my superior, it's not appropriate for me to interrupt them and tell them that they're being ridiculous or an idiot or something like that. If I'm talking to my peers, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, right? And that's just kind of, again, the natural order, right? So you and I are peers. We're roughly the same age group. I don't work for you. You're not my dad. I don't have, you're not the president of my country, right? I don't owe you like a deference of like natural authority. Mm-hmm. My priest, if he were to come in, it would be very inappropriate for me to interrupt him and say, "Oh, you're being idiotic," right? That wouldn't, because that's going against sort of, well, not just the natural order, but it's going against even the supernatural hierarchy that God has in place. Yeah. There is appropriate way to go about disagreeing with or even rebuking a superior. There is a call for that. And in fact, at times it's a sin not to do that, right? Like if a superior were to come into the room and say, well, I'm your priest, I'm your spiritual authority, I command you to, you know, I don't know, give me all your money because I'm your superior.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that would be an overstepping of his authority, and that would be wrong for him to do it. And it would be wrong for me to go along with or be complicit in something like that. So, you know, there's a lot of basic ideas of like how we're supposed to understand interactions and what's appropriate in society. And, you know, it would be inappropriate for my wife to come and just get up in my face and start yelling at me, given the fact that like I'm her superior, right? Doesn't mean that I had the right to abuse her, but still there's a role that's appropriate and inappropriate there. So I would say you're right that the way that, that I might interact with or disagree with somebody on the internet or in a blood, and also keep in mind too, that when we do something that's like an open forum, that's a free for all. Nobody's forcing them to call in. Nobody's forcing them, and they're on my home court. So I have the right to say, all right, we're not going to listen to this. You're not, you know, you're avoiding the issue, blah, blah, blah. If I called into their show, I'd be on their home court. They can boot me if they want to, right? So again, there's a lot of, and a formal debate is not the same thing as an informal debate. Mm-hmm. Informal debates and discussions of things like this, but you'll notice in the formal debates, most of the time, 99% of the time that I've done those with prominent Muslims or atheists, I handle that in a very specific, ordered way. There's not a lot of ad hominem or rhetoric. It's mainly argumentation. So I come out of the world of philosophy. Not everybody does. You know, in philosophy class back in the day, we had debate club. I was involved in debate club for 3 years of college. So that's where I come from. That's my milieu. That's what I was kind of raised with. So that might be something more natural to me. And other people don't know debate. They're not interested in it. They're not familiar with it. They might see it as abrasive or controversial or whatever. But to me, it doesn't seem to be controversial. It's just kind of who I am, where I am, and the way I operate. Doesn't mean that I think that debate and rational discourse is the only way that people come to truth. There's a lot of ways that people come to truth. Sometimes people have a death in their family, and that leads them to Christ or to Orthodoxy. Sometimes you know, they go to a beautiful liturgy and that leads them to the aesthetics, impress them, right? And that gets them interested. So there's all different types of ways that people might come into the truth. And in the history of the church, we've seen all kinds of different people with different approaches. You know, St. Justin Martyr is called Justin the philosopher. Mm-hmm. So he was interested in philosophy and how that might convince people. Paul uses philosophy in Acts 17. Reasons with the unbelievers. So I don't think that it's the only way or the sole way or even the best way per se, but you know, it's just who I am and what I do. But no, I don't apologize for debate in itself or for even being quote controversial. If there's something specifically I did wrong, I can apologize for it, and I've done that before.
Yeah, I really like what you said. You pointing out like the natural roles that you find yourself, the situation that you're in as well, you know, whether you're a philosopher or, you know, if you're a 16-year-old kid who's still like, you know, struggling to find your way in life, maybe you shouldn't be out there telling your teachers or your parents like what they should be doing and how they're, you know, doing whatever. So it's really about being aware of who you are and where you're at and
your role.
What is your natural role to be?
Professors is a good example because I was bad about that when I was 18, 19. I would debate with my professors all the time, which was inappropriate. Mm-hmm. It was not the right way to go about that. But I was, you know, super arrogant 18, 19, 20-year-old philosophy student. So so I'm not saying that I'm not guilty. I've done that before.
But they were probably wrong back then, or what? Like, what would have happened?
The professors were wrong, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't still an arrogant, you know, kid. So
what do you think would have been different if you met an 18-year-old and he was receptive to you and you saw he was like having this arrogant attitude towards his professors? What kind of advice would you give to that 18-year-old today?
I would say even if you're correct, there's no point in doing this. It's just not appropriate. There might be cases. I think the problem is not whether it's right or wrong. It's rather the wisdom to know when and to do it and when to not do it. So let's say, for example, we're in class and the professor's teaching. Mm-hmm. If I keep interrupting and raising my hand to try to debate him, that's not really appropriate, right? It's not a wise interaction, even if I'm correct. But let's say the teacher says, all right, I've given you my arguments for atheism. Do we have any theists in the class who'd like to present their theistic arguments? Then it would be appropriate. You know what I mean? So I think when you're young, you don't really have the wisdom and the savvy of interactions and when it's appropriate. And I think because people now, the younger you go, the more those kids live on the internet, they have even less social skills and figuring out when it's appropriate to do what. So all that plays into it.
Yeah. And we're just so disconnected from natural, organic human relationships, not just the internet, but also large cities, I would say.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like things are, so me and my wife, we've been living in Copenhagen, both of us, for 20 years. And now we've moved out into a tiny little town with 300 people. We're right next to the church. There's one little shop. And so if you want to know where it's happening, everybody that, there's just a natural way of life happening here. And it's so clear how in the city, it makes you crazy. You actually become insane living in these big cities because things are just so fragmented and disconnected, and you're living like sardines packed into these apartments of each other. It's alienating, and there isn't this natural embeddedness and feeling of connection with other human beings around you.
Well, even the city life, like I was watching this documentary a couple of days ago with Michael Caine, and he was talking about what it was like growing up in the 50s and 60s in Britain, and when he got to be famous, when he was starting to get roles. And he was like, he was comparing it and contrasting it to the way it is now. And it was like, to him being I guess a boomer and trying to explain that, in the 60s, he was like, we were out every night meeting people all the time. I go to this club, I go to this place, met people all the time. And anytime you wanted any interactions or anything, he's like, you didn't even call them, you would just go meet them. And he was talking about just how crazy different it is now, to where it's like, people don't even do this anymore. And it was just like blowing his mind. And I was thinking, yeah, I mean, I'm not even a boomer, but I can see from like the late 90s. And I grew up both in a small town and in a big town. So I had the contrast in the 90s of both. So it's definitely much more wholesome, like you said, in a small town setting, out of these, because the big cities have gotten even worse than they were even in the 90s.
Yeah. So I'm experiencing, even here in Denmark, that there's a whole lot of young men, especially, that are they're seeing like, this is all crazy. None of this makes sense. This stuff isn't working. For some of them, there's just some little point of input where Christianity comes into their life, and they start searching online, and then they find Orthodoxy. And then they go and like look, and then they pitch up at like some Greek or Romanian church somewhere. And I'm like, hey, what's this? There's no one that speaks really their language, but like they're really keen and interested. So one of the challenges, of course, is like a lot of these ethnic churches aren't really ready to give a proper catechesis to these people. And so a lot of them are getting it from the internet, which has great parts to it, but is not so great as well.
Also has drawbacks, yeah.
What can we do about this, Jay? What do you what are your thoughts about the situation, and how are we working with it?
Yeah, there's no easy answer to this. A lot of people have been saying this too, for 7, 8, 10 years, that a lot of people can only find Orthodoxy via the internet, and then the catechesis is difficult because, like you said, a lot of parishes are heavily ethnic, and I don't know that there's an easy answer to this. I think it's just going to take time, because as people come into Orthodoxy, and then as time allows them to be better trained, you won't need to hear what Jay Dyer says about Orthodoxy. And I don't have any problem stepping out of that role. I didn't intend to get on the internet and be a popular, Orthodox YouTuber apologist. It wasn't my intention. It was just sort of a thing that kind of snowballed. It happened, but I'm happy to recede into the background. And I think it's much more wholesome and healthy for people to get that catechesis at the local level from the spiritual fathers, when they can, and if they can. And hopefully that will get better, because like you said, sometimes it's not good. There's a lot of deficiencies there. There's a lot of priests that didn't get good catechesis and theological formation themselves. I just think time will fix that, because a lot of the new guys that have been coming in, for example, some of the people that we helped to convert back in 2017, 18, I mean, they're about to graduate seminary. They're super solid. They're super based. So they're going to be priests pretty soon, hopefully, Lord willing. And I think that they're going to be able to, train people, lead people. So it's just a thing that takes time. And then more and more strong men in parishes will be the way that they can set up the right catechesis at the local level. That's the key. So I think hopefully, ideally, internet catechesis, as bad as it is, whatever, if it can be just like a signpost that tells guys to look here, then hopefully over time, maybe in the next 5 years, a lot of parishes will have established a kind of solid theological catechesis. That would be ideal.
Yeah. No, I'm as bad as it is, but I also got to say how amazingly fantastic and powerful it is as well. I really sometimes wonder, like, how is it possible that my father has dedicated his entire life to God as a Protestant pastor, minister, and he's searched the deepest, most, he's really dedicated his life to becoming the best Christian that he can possibly be. But he never had the opportunity to find orthodoxy. And so this thing that, it just never, it never occurred to him. It wasn't, for him, it was like there was these Greeks somewhere in South Africa, right? Where he lived, like, it just didn't make sense. So the fact that it's suddenly flooding into the West right now in a way that's never happened, for 1,000 years, it hasn't been possible for Westerners really to find out about Orthodoxy. So for me, there's almost something eschatological about this. I think I would say it's like it seems to be too much. And the only explanation I can have is like, we're getting this because we need it, because we're gonna need it. We're gonna need the strength, and we're gonna need strong men. It's not easy to take those decisions as a man today in society to move towards orthodoxy. There's a lot of things that you're going to give up and get rejected by social circles and stuff like that. But I see like really, really good guys who are making that decision. Like if your heart's in the right place and you understand what orthodoxy is, that's where you're going to go. And I think you're doing a great job, Jay, in putting that case forward. I don't know if you've seen it, but I've seen a study where they looked at people who are converting to Orthodoxy in the last 5-10 years, and what was the number one name of people who that had been influenced them, and your name was on the top of that list. And I think you're right. Like, yeah, sure, some of these people are not seeing like the kind-hearted, compassionate side of Orthodoxy in the first interview that they see with Tom Jump or whatever it was. That was the first interview I saw with you.
That also was an informal debate, by the way, right? That was informal debate, not a formal debate.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, wow, okay, this is really interesting. But it was entertaining.
There's another element too so a lot of people that don't engage in this sphere, they're not familiar with what the conversation, the discourse is like in the world of atheism or in the world of Islam. So, for example, in the world of Islam, it's very much a lot of machismo. It's a lot of smack talking, right? It's like when guys go out on the basketball court, right? When guys are playing basketball, there's a lot of talking smack, right? That's just how guys do. I grew up playing basketball and all, that's what you're used to as a guy. You talk smack, right? And I'm not saying it's good, but it's the reality of, in the world of, say, debating Muslims and whatnot, if you don't come with confidence and some degree of machismo, it's sort of like the Arab mind is not going to listen to you or pay any attention to you. But if you show that you're not afraid, you're not scared, the insults don't bother you, don't care, they're a little more apt, I think, to listen to something like that. If you're engaging with atheists and you're not afraid, you're not on the defensive, I think that that in a way kind of speaks to a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't listen. So the point of debates, for those that don't know, isn't really necessarily to convince the opponent. You might, in some cases it has, that's rare. But the purpose of the debate is really for the audience to hear, for the audience to listen to the argumentation. So I typically just assume that my audience can kind of look past, jabs and jokes and rhetoric, which has always been a part of classical debate. Obviously it can go too far, you can get too extreme or whatever, but no, debate's a masculine thing. Church fathers debated. It's part of classical Western pedagogy. Nothing inherently bad about debate. So yeah, it's just,
you mentioned Justin
I think I get tired of it, honestly. Like we've been doing debates for 5 years with prominent people, right? Atheists, Muslims, Roman Catholics, whatever. I get tired of it. It gets old, mainly because it's sort of like you always hear the same thing. And it seems like sometimes it gets like, if you've had the same debate with atheists over 5 years with Roman Catholics, at a certain point they kind of start getting really mad at you, Like it's no longer about the issues. Now it's like they're after you. Mm-hmm. So maybe debate has kind of served its purpose for a few years, and maybe now it's time to step away from it. And I'll probably actually I have one more pretty prominent Muslim that I'm debating in January, and I'll probably will take a long break from debating, just because it's kind of
okay.
It just seems like the same old debate every time. It's like, how many times do I have to have the same? You know what I mean?
I have a guy that I'd like you to have a debate with. Let's if you're up for it. I started Manifesto, my business, with a guy who is a Zoroastrian. It was before I was a Christian myself.
Wow.
He calls himself a Zoroastrian. Okay. I'm not convinced he's a real Zoroastrian, but he's a Swedish philosopher, and he's also, I would say, I think I can say publicly, like, he's also something of an entertainer. He's been a judge on the Swedish Pop Idol program.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So he has a really colorful personality.
Well, it sounds like a colorful debate. So I might.
Yeah. So if you're up for that, I'd love to send an email to him and you and see if we can make that happen. Could just be a discussion. He's been very involved in the men's movement in Sweden, and very engaged there. But there's definitely a lot of stuff that you guys, I think, could get into disagreeing about as well. So his name's Alexander.
Yeah, I'm definitely open to talking to, we've talked to everybody, so I'm open to that.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Jay. I really appreciate you taking the time to have the conversation. I found it very helpful and useful. And again, just thank you for the work that you're doing. I have several friends who follow everything that you do, and get a lot of value out of it. And I've got to say, from diving into your work, I've just grown more in my appreciation of the way I see it. This is my very first impression in this conversation. I said that I was like, this guy's role is he's a philosophical debater, and he's really good at it, and he's doing it well, and he's doing it to the glory of God. So thank you, Jay. It's great.
Well, thank you, man. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. I look forward to chatting again.